Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. I could feel something slipping away in my marriage, like sand seeping through my fingers. Laura and I had been together for 15 years, and I thought we were solid. Sure, we'd had our share of ups and downs, but who hasn't after so many years? But then the work trips started happening more often, mostly over weekends, and my stomach began twisting each time she left. She'd started brushing off my questions with practiced ease, assuring me with a breezy laugh that her company was demanding more as she climbed the ladder. I wanted to believe her. But when she started avoiding eye contact and hiding her phone, I knew something was wrong. I tried to suppress my doubts, convincing myself that I was overreacting. But one night, curiosity got the best of me. She'd left her work phone on the kitchen counter, carelessly unguarded, while she ran upstairs to grab her suitcase. As I glanced at the screen, a text popped up from an Adam. I froze, fingers trembling as I picked up the phone and skimmed the latest message. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My heart pounded, and my mind raced. Who was this guy? But I couldn't confront her without solid proof. She'd deny everything and probably flip it around, make it seem like I was paranoid or insecure. I needed to be smart. I reached out to a private investigator the next morning. It felt surreal, like a scene out of a bad movie, but I was determined to know the truth. The investigator's name was Dennis, a middle-aged guy with a quiet demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, he kept tabs on Laura. I tried to focus on my work and the kids, but it was impossible. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, half hoping, half dreading that it was Dennis with an update. I barely slept, my mind replaying her words, her tone, every little thing that could have been a lie. The kids noticed that something was up. "Dad, you okay?" my oldest, Ethan, asked one night. He was 14, old enough to pick up on the tension but too young to understand it all. I nodded, trying to reassure him, telling him it was just a rough week. But the words felt hollow. Then one day, Dennis called. "I've got something," he said, his voice steady but grave. I left work early, my hands clammy as I gripped the steering wheel. I met him at his office, a small, cluttered room tucked away in an unassuming building. Dennis laid a file on his desk and opened it, his expression unreadable. "Your wife's been seeing this guy, Adam, for a while," he said, gesturing to a stack of photos. They showed Laura and a man, mid-30s, well-dressed, and comfortably intimate. In one picture, she was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his arm. Another showed them leaving a hotel together. "Are you sure?" My voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. He nodded, placing his hand on the file, as though to ground the emotions spiraling between us. "Yes. I'm sorry, but the evidence is clear. I know this isn't easy." The ride home was a blur. I had the proof, but it felt hollow, a sick confirmation of something I wished I'd been wrong about. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the photos laid out in front of me, watching the clock until dawn. When Laura returned home the next day, I was ready. As she walked through the door, her eyes met mine, and I could see the flicker of guilt and shock ripple across her face as she noticed the stack of photos on the table. She quickly composed herself, attempting a smile, as though nothing was wrong. "What's all this?" she asked, feigning confusion. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "Just some souvenirs from your work trips, Laura." Her expression faltered, and for a moment, I saw the truth in her eyes, fear, shame, maybe even a sliver of regret. But she quickly hardened, her jaw set as she launched into denial. "I can explain," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't bother. I know everything. The weekend work trips, the hotel stays, and Adam, I know, Laura." My voice was calm, icy, unlike anything I'd ever heard come out of my mouth. She looked away, her gaze darting around the room, avoiding mine. It's not what you think, she said, grasping at anything to deflect the weight of the betrayal. Adam and I. Don't, I interrupted, my voice laced with a bitterness I hadn't realized was there. Just don't. She flinched, and I took a step back, realizing how desperately I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the hurt she'd caused me. Laura tried again, her tone shifting to pleading, her eyes misty. It didn't mean anything, I swear. It was just. I don't know, a distraction, something I thought would fill a void. I was wrong. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the pain too raw to even bear her touch. I shook my head, unable to look at her. You've been lying to me, to the kids, all this time. Do you have any idea what you've done to us? To this family? Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I saw the woman I married, the one I'd built a life with, standing there in front of me. But then I remembered Adam, the hotel rooms, the stolen glances, and that image vanished, replaced by a stranger I no longer recognized. I was lonely, she whispered, as though that would make everything better. You were always busy with work, and I felt like I was invisible to you. My anger flared. So, it's my fault. Is that what you're saying? The words felt like a final blow, shattering whatever fragile thread had been holding us together. She didn't answer, just stood there, tears streaming down her face, as I let the silence hang between us. Finally, I took a deep breath, the reality of my decision settling over me like a weight. I want a divorce. The words were heavy but resolute, freeing in a way I hadn't expected. Laura's eyes widened, her face paling as though she hadn't expected things to reach this point. Please, don't, she whispered, her voice cracking. Let me make it right. I'll end things with Adam, I'll be better, I promise. But it was too late. The damage was done. Every promise felt like an empty echo, and I knew I could never trust her again. I turned away, my mind already focusing on the next steps, dividing assets, moving forward, reclaiming my life. As I left the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a calm acceptance of what lay ahead. I was finally free. The reality of what lay ahead began to settle in over the next few days, each moment a reminder of what had been lost. Our home had been a haven, a place where we'd shared milestones and built a life together, but now, it felt hollow. It seemed like the walls, once alive with the memories of laughter and quiet conversations, were now closing in on me, echoing the silence of betrayal. Laura tried everything to get me to reconsider. I'd never seen her plead like this, her desperation raw and unguarded. She threw out apologies, promises of therapy, even plans to rebuild trust, as though these words could erase what she had done. She spent hours rehearsing her reasons, her explanations, and each time, I felt the same pang of disbelief that the woman I'd trusted, the mother of my children, had made this decision so casually. But I couldn't bear to engage with her, to even entertain the idea of patching things up. I started spending more time at work, using late nights and extra projects as an excuse to avoid home. The kids noticed, of course. Ethan especially. He'd catch my eye sometimes, his expression a mix of worry and confusion. He wasn't old enough to know the full truth, but he sensed something was different. I remember one evening in particular, sitting in the living room while Laura was in the kitchen. Ethan came in and sat next to me, not saying anything, just looking at me with those wide, serious eyes. Finally, he asked, "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" The question cut through me like a blade, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He was only 14, too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but I owed him some kind of answer. "We're going through something," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "But it's not your fault. You know that, right? No matter what happens, your mom and I both love you and your sister." He nodded, but I could see the worry lingering in his eyes. I wished I could take it all away, protect him from the truth, but I knew that shielding him completely wasn't an option. He'd see the changes soon enough, the missing wedding ring, the sudden absence of family dinners, the stilted conversations between his parents. The next few days were a whirlwind of lawyer consultations and paperwork. I filed for divorce, and with each document signed, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. It was surreal to think that a piece of paper could unravel 15 years of marriage, but in some ways, it made the decision feel more concrete, more real. The lawyer assured me that we could make the process as smooth as possible, and that with careful planning, the division of assets wouldn't be too complicated. But smooth or not, the weight of it all was inescapable. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, a glass of whiskey in front of me. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the house settling. My mind drifted back to the early days of my relationship with Laura, back when everything felt effortless. I could still remember our first apartment, a cramped little place with peeling wallpaper and a rickety bed frame. We'd been young, broke, and stupidly happy, content with late-night pizza and hand-me-down furniture. The woman I'd loved back then seemed like a ghost now, a memory trapped in a past that felt almost unreal. Just then, Laura walked into the kitchen, breaking me from my thoughts. She looked different, worn down, as if the weight of her choices was finally settling on her shoulders. She stood by the counter, hesitating, as though gathering the courage to speak. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I took a slow sip of my drink, steeling myself. "What is there left to say?" She fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, avoiding my gaze. "I know you don't owe me anything, not after what I did. But I need you to understand. I wasn't myself. I felt lost, like I was drifting, and Adam, he made me feel seen. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but..." "Stop." My voice was colder than I intended, but I couldn't help it. "Don't try to justify this. You had a choice, Laura. You chose him. You chose to break our family for, what? Some temporary thrill? I thought we were building something real." Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But it was quickly snuffed out by the anger that had been simmering inside me since the day I discovered the truth. "I was stupid," she whispered. "Selfish. I know that now. I just wish I could take it all back." "Well, you can't," I replied, standing up. "You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." I left the room before I could say anything more, retreating to the small study I'd converted into a temporary bedroom. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have been. Every memory felt tainted, every shared moment a reminder of the trust that had been shattered. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She was efficient, professional, guiding me through the legal maze of divorce with practiced ease. She assured me that we could protect my assets, minimize the financial fallout. It was a cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. She suggested I keep a close eye on our joint accounts, especially since Laura's spending habits had been erratic lately. The thought of her siphoning off our hard-earned savings for her affair stung, but I wasn't about to let her take more than her share. That evening, I began to sift through our finances, going over each transaction, each expense, looking for any signs of dishonesty. It was tedious work, but it gave me a sense of control, a way to reclaim some of the power I'd lost in the wake of her betrayal. As I combed through the records, I found a few suspicious charges, hotel bills, restaurant tabs, expenses that didn't align with her work schedule. Each discovery was like a fresh wound, a reminder of the lies she'd woven so skillfully over the months. But it was the withdrawal from our joint savings that stopped me cold. $3,000, taken out on the same day as one of her supposed work trips. My mind raced, piecing together the puzzle, and with a sickening sense of dread, I realized that she'd likely used the money to fund her weekends with Adam. The thought made my stomach turn, anger flaring up anew. The next few days were filled with the mundane logistics of separation, discussing child custody arrangements, sorting through household belongings, dividing up possessions. We kept things civil for the kids, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Laura tried to be amicable, making offers to split things fairly, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the regret that had finally set in. One night, after the kids were asleep, she approached me again, her expression defeated. "I know you probably hate me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But can you at least tell me that you'll let me be a part of the kids' lives? I don't want them to think that I don't care." I looked at her, this woman who had once been my partner, my confidant, and now, a stranger. "You're still their mother, Laura. But don't expect me to pretend that this never happened. They deserve the truth, even if they're too young to understand it right now. When they're older, they'll know what you did." She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, but she just nodded, accepting the consequences of her actions. We stood in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging between us. And in that silence, I realized that I was finally ready to let go, to release the anger, the hurt, and to move on. The day we moved out felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. I'd been preparing for it in the weeks since filing for divorce, boxing up our lives, bit by bit, until it became clear there was no going back. Laura would stay in the house with the kids initially. It made sense given the kids' routines and their friends nearby, but eventually, the property would be sold, and the family home we'd built together would pass to someone else, just another chapter closing in this painful saga. Packing up my things was both a practical task and a form of closure. Each item, my books, framed pictures, old mementos, felt weighted with memories I didn't want to relive. Every corner of that house held some piece of us, but it was especially hard to pack away the remnants of my life as part of a couple. I boxed up old vacation souvenirs, our wedding album, even the anniversary gifts I'd once carefully selected, thinking we'd cherish them forever. The last box I packed held the family photo albums. It seemed ridiculous to take them, but somehow I couldn't leave them behind. They were a record of the life we'd created together, a reminder that, despite everything, there had been moments of happiness, of genuine love. I'd sort through them later, when I was ready. For now, they went in a box labeled simply "Memories," and I set it aside. By the time I was done, the house felt different, like a hollow shell. I stood in the doorway, taking one last look at the place that had once been my haven. It struck me that even though the walls and floors were the same, the spirit of our home had vanished. This wasn't my home anymore, it was just a place I used to live. As I loaded the last box into my car, Laura came out, watching me silently from the porch. Her face was etched with regret, her eyes hollow, as though she were finally grasping the weight of what she'd done. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface, a reminder of everything I couldn't forgive. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Can't we try to make it work for the kids?" I looked at her, the woman I'd once thought I'd grow old with, and shook my head. "It's not what I want, Laura. It's what you chose." The words hung between us, final and unyielding. As I drove away, I felt an odd mixture of relief and sadness. The grief was still there, but it was lighter somehow, as though I'd shed a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I was moving forward, leaving behind the broken pieces of a life I'd once cherished. But there was still so much to sort through, to understand, before I could fully heal. The first night in my new apartment was strange. The silence was thicker, heavier without the usual background noise of the kids laughing, the sound of Laura in the kitchen, the low hum of family life. I found myself pacing the small living room, my mind restless. I was free, in a sense, but that freedom felt cold, empty. I hadn't anticipated the loneliness, the hollow ache of a house stripped of warmth, of laughter. I spent the evening sifting through emails and organizing my work schedule, anything to avoid thinking about the reality of my new life. The distraction helped, at least until I came across an email from Laura's lawyer. It was a simple update, just a list of paperwork that needed signing, but seeing her name in my inbox sent a jolt of anger through me. It felt as though she was still trying to pull strings, still tethering me to the life I was desperate to leave behind. But I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. Over the next few weeks, I began establishing new routines. I'd wake up early to hit the gym, pushing my body to the limits, feeling the tension drain away with each weight lifted, each mile run. After work, I'd spend time exploring the city, rediscovering places I hadn't visited in years. It was a quiet reclaiming of my identity, a way of reminding myself that there was life beyond betrayal. The hardest part was the weekends with the kids. We'd agreed on shared custody, and though I missed them terribly during the week, the weekends became a lifeline, a reminder that there were still pieces of my life worth holding on to. We'd go to the park, have movie nights, order pizza, and pretend, for those brief moments, that everything was normal. But the kids were perceptive, they sensed the change, even if they couldn't fully understand it. One Saturday, as we were sitting in the park, Ethan looked up at me, his brow furrowed. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "are you and Mom not going to live together anymore?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Things are going to be different, buddy. Your mom and we're going through a tough time. But no matter what happens, we both love you and your sister more than anything. That's not going to change." He nodded, looking down at his hands, and for a moment, I saw a flash of sadness in his eyes, a glimpse of the pain he was trying to understand. I wanted to shield him from it, to protect him from the fallout of our decisions, but I knew there were some things I couldn't fix. Over time, Laura's attempts to reconcile grew less frequent. She stopped calling, stopped sending late-night messages filled with regret. I could tell she'd finally accepted the reality of our situation, though there were still moments when I could see the struggle in her eyes when we exchanged the kids. She was trying, in her own way, to piece together a new life, just as I was. Then came the day I'd been dreading, the sale of the house. We met at the real estate office, signing the papers that would finalize the end of our family home. It was a quiet, somber occasion, the final nail in the coffin of our life together. Afterward, we stood outside, neither of us quite ready to walk away. "I'm sorry," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can never make it right. But I hope, someday, you'll be able to forgive me." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not just my ex-wife, but a person struggling with her own pain, her own regrets. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive her, not fully, but in that moment, I felt a flicker of empathy, a small crack in the wall of anger I'd built around myself. "I don't know if I can," I replied honestly. "But I hope, for the kids' sake, we can at least move forward. They deserve that." She nodded, a hint of relief softening her features. "Thank you. I'll do my best." With that, we parted ways, each of us stepping into our separate lives, forever changed. I drove back to my apartment, a sense of finality settling over me. This was it, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The grief lingered, the memories still raw, but I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to rebuild. That night, I opened the memories box I'd packed before leaving the house. I sifted through the photos, the mementos, the pieces of a life that felt like someone else's. As I flipped through the album, I found myself smiling at old memories, moments that had been real, even if they were now tainted by everything that had happened. I knew I couldn't erase the pain, the betrayal, but I could hold on to the good parts, the pieces of love and joy that had once been genuine. And in doing so, I realized I was taking the first steps toward healing, toward a future that was mine to shape. Life took on a sense of new normalcy over the following months, each day a careful balancing act between my work, my time with the kids, and the fragments of my social life that I was slowly piecing back together. There was a comfort in the routine, a kind of quiet assurance that, despite everything, life moved forward. But still, a part of me remained tethered to the past, an invisible line that pulled tight every time I saw Laura or thought of our old life. The divorce had been finalized, the house sold, and all the logistics were neatly closed out. Ethan and Lily had adapted well, or at least as well as I could have hoped. They laughed, joked, even teased me the way they used to, and while I could see them tiptoeing around certain topics, we found our own rhythm. I felt cautiously optimistic about the future, letting myself believe that we'd turned a corner. The wounds might never fully heal, but they'd become manageable scars, reminders of a hurt that had softened with time. Then one evening, everything changed. It was a Friday night, and the kids were with Laura for the weekend. I'd gone out with some old friends from college, their company a rare escape from the heaviness that had clouded my life for so long. We spent the evening swapping stories, laughing about old times, a comforting reminder of the person I used to be. It was late when I returned home, feeling lighter than I had in months. The house was quiet, a comfortable silence that welcomed me as I walked through the door. I was halfway through checking my messages when my phone buzzed, and I saw Laura's name flash across the screen. It was well past midnight, and for a moment, my stomach knotted. I knew she wouldn't be calling this late unless something was wrong. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, and then a voice, trembling and frantic. "It's Ethan," she managed, her voice cracking. He's in the hospital." I felt the world tilt, my pulse hammering in my ears as I struggled to process her words. "What happened?" My voice came out strangled, barely more than a whisper. "He collapsed," she said, her voice a broken whisper. "He was fine, and then, he just collapsed. The doctors think it's something with his heart. Please, come quickly." I didn't wait to hear more. I was out the door in seconds, racing down empty streets, the chill of the night pressing in around me as I drove to the hospital. 1,000 thoughts churned through my mind, my brain grasping for explanations, reasons that this couldn't be happening. Ethan was healthy, strong, my son who'd spent hours running around the yard, laughing and teasing me. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. When I arrived, Laura was already in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed with worry. She looked up when she saw me, and for the first time in months, we didn't speak as exes or co-parents, but simply as two terrified parents clinging to each other in the face of the unimaginable. The hours dragged by, each second a torturous eternity as we waited for answers. Finally, a doctor approached us, his expression grim. He explained that Ethan had suffered a sudden heart failure. They were doing everything they could, but the prognosis was uncertain. Words like genetic condition, rare complications, and cardiac arrest floated around us, barely registering as I struggled to hold on to the hope that he'd be okay. The doctor suggested we go in to see him, just in case. Just in case. Those words felt like a knife twisting in my chest, a final blow to whatever hope I'd been clinging to. Laura and I walked into the sterile, quiet room together, the weight of fear pressing down on us. Ethan looked so small lying there, tubes and monitors surrounding him, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sign that he was still with us. His face was pale, his usually bright eyes closed, and as I took his hand, it felt cold, lifeless in my grasp. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, forcing my voice to stay steady. "It's Dad. I'm here." Laura sat on the other side, her hands trembling as she touched his hair, smoothing it back gently, her face twisted with grief and regret. And in that moment, none of the past mattered. The betrayal, the lies, the anger, it all fell away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered love we had for our son. Minutes passed in silence, each breath we took a painful reminder of the fragility of life. I thought of every moment I'd spent with him, every laugh, every hug, every quiet conversation. I'd always thought we'd have so much more time. That I'd watch him grow up, teach him to drive, see him graduate, maybe even get married someday. But now, all those dreams hung by the thinnest of threads, slipping further from reach with each passing second. Then, suddenly, the monitors around us began to beep erratically. Nurses and doctors rushed in, their voices a blur as they worked to stabilize him. I felt Laura's grip on my arm tighten as we were ushered out of the room, the door closing on the last glimpse of our son, fighting for his life. We waited in silence, neither of us able to speak, both praying for a miracle. But deep down, I knew. I felt it in my bones, a hollow ache that told me this was the end. Hours later, the doctor returned, his face etched with sorrow. He didn't have to say anything. I could see it in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "We did everything we could, but he didn't make it." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one driving deeper into my chest. I felt Laura's hand slip from my arm as she crumpled, sobbing uncontrollably. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, my entire world shattering in an instant. The days that followed were a blur. Arrangements were made, condolences poured in, people offered words of comfort that felt hollow, meaningless. The grief was a weight I couldn't escape, a pain that settled deep in my bones, aching and raw. Laura and I moved through it together, bound by our shared loss, but neither of us able to find comfort in each other. We were united in our grief, yet each of us alone in our suffering. At the funeral, I stood by Ethan's casket, my hand resting on the polished wood, feeling a sadness so profound it left me hollow. I glanced at Laura, who was pale and distant, her eyes red from days of crying. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the depths of her regret, her sorrow not just for the life we'd lost, but for everything we'd destroyed. Afterward, as we stood alone, she reached out, her voice a whisper. "I'm so sorry. For everything. If I could take it all back." I looked at her, seeing in her eyes the same emptiness that I felt. We both lost him, Laura. And nothing will ever make that right. In that moment, I realized that some wounds would never heal. Our family, once fractured by betrayal, was now irrevocably shattered, broken in a way that could never be mended. The life I'd imagined, the dreams I'd held onto for my son, were gone, replaced by a hollow ache that would follow me for the rest of my days. And as I walked away from the graveside, I knew that this was the true cost of betrayal, a price paid not only by those who make the choices, but by the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. In the end, there was no moving on, no fresh start, only the cold, unyielding weight of a loss that would never fade.